In this chapter, we're going to talk about this pawn structure, which the author dubs the Panov structure. Actually, he says himself that, well, perhaps it's slightly confusing because, well, the Panov structure is normally pawns on c4 and d4, and very often there will be an exchange on d5 leading to an isolated pawn structure. But this we have covered separately. So in this sort of course, when we talk about the Panov structure, we mean this exact structure with white having gained space on the queen side like this. And it's true, it quite often happens from the Panov structure with white playing the move c5. It's almost like self-explanatory from the white perspective, right? You get a spatial advantage, or rather you get this strong protected pass pawn on c5. And if things develop slowly, if you get to actually cover it with b4, let's say a3 as well, you're just going to have this massive pawn on c5, which almost becomes like a material advantage. It's a potential pass pawn in the endgame. It really suppresses the black counterplay, and everything will start surrounding around that. So from white's perspective, it's pretty simple. If you can maintain this pawn on c5, most likely you can have a considerable advantage. It's, if anything, a little bit more interesting and flexible if you look at it from the black perspective, because obviously, well, if this is so good for white, it means reverse, it's pretty bad for black. So we have to do something about it. Well, the logical way is, as with most pawn chains, let's try to undermine them. So one plan is playing b6. And then it becomes very much a matter of, can white sort of, well, manage to sustain it with b4 and keep this pawn? Or is he forced to exchange on b6, giving away his sort of central edge and even leaving himself with a weak isolated pawn on d4? So b6 is a very critical way to sort of attack this pawn chain. But you can also undermine the pawn chain with a move like e5, right? And, well, if this pawn has to take in this direction, the c5 pawn could end up being weak. So it's very relevant if black can undermine this strong center or not. But it's even not the last of black trumps. Sometimes a knight from f6 can jump to the e4 square. And, well, you might back it up with a pawn like f5, and you end up having this very strong knight on the e4 square. Or sometimes you might even just exchange on c3 and create double pawns, which means, well, the sort of attraction of the pawn on c5 loses quite some of its value. So it's a very controversial and interesting pawn structure. I think we have seen this pattern by now, that some structures are very general and leads to equal plays, while others can be favorable for one of the sides in general. And then there are structures like this that perhaps are balanced overall, but more typically leads to be either favorable for one side or the other, because they're very defining. And I think, well, this is one of those as well, that of course there might be situations where it ends up equal, but either this pawn on c5 is going to be very strong, or it can be quite weak, or it can be eliminated. So it's an interesting pawn structure to talk about. So let's go into the details. Black is facing an interesting dilemma here, and I remember it from quite some of my own games. Are we afraid of white pushing the move c5? I guess people like me, we are always afraid. So I'll be afraid of everything. But it's important to evaluate, is c5 a threat or not? Because if it is actually a genuine threat, we have to do something about it. I mean, one thing could be to take on c4. And now this, well, we get the hanging pawn structure with its pluses and minuses, as debated in the previous chapter. It could also be that if we don't like to play against hanging pawns and we are still afraid of c5, we could consider a move like b6, just playing it cautiously. And actually, both these things would have been quite better choices than what Galic did in the game, because Galic chose to castle, and now Dreyev played this very strong move c5, and he just has a considerable advantage already. I mean, I guess it just comes down to being a very relevant space advantage. There is for sure examples where such space advantage is not very relevant, but here it certainly is. And part of the problem for black is that he can't really get rid of it. I mean, the author mentions after b6, it runs into c6. That works pretty well tactically for white. His line is rook fc8, and now he thinks knight e5 is a knight move. It sort of attacks the bishop backwards and also connects with the pawn on c6, right? And that is true. I mean, white is better after, well, if you take on e5, the problem is we're going to take back. And when this knight moves, we can win the h7 pawn like this, for instance. So if bishop h5, we're just going to connect like this, and we have a threat of bishop a6, and we are much better. That is true. But the computer says it's a nice tactic, but we don't really need it. Even a move like b4 is just much, much better for white. And if you take on c5, we can take with the b pawn, or we can even take with the c pawn and go for these. Both options are strong for white. So in general, it seems like here black is just in trouble. I mean, imagine a situation where, let's say, this knight on d7 would be on the c6 square. We could play a5 followed by b6. Maybe black would be doing quite okay. But this is not at all the case here. Galish chooses to play bishop to h5. It's a typical plan, right? You put the bishop on g6 and you try to neutralize the power of these pieces. It's generally a good idea, but here, well, there's nothing wrong with it. It's just an unpleasant situation for black. I mean, white, well, is going to expand on the queen side, and there's not much you can do against it. I don't think we're necessarily in the region of talking about white being winning. That would be going too far. But we are not in the region of sort of tiny advantages of white being pleasant. No, we're talking about a massive strategical edge for white. And, well, it's about this space. And it is a lot of space. It's a major pawn we see on c5. And just allowing your opponent to get this kind of strong, almost passed pawn, but also this foothold on your side of the board, if you don't have any kind of way of undermining it or get any kind of compensation for it, then that's a major strategic mistake, as we see here. So the game went bishop to g6. There was an exchange. Well, we can always debate if these pawns are weak or not, but I think for our perspectives in this game, it doesn't matter much. So the game was rook fe1, knight to h5, knight to f1. I think one should pay attention to how slowly white is doing it, right? Imagine this pawn being on c3 instead. It would be a Carlsbad structure, and we would think black is doing pretty okay. I mean, white would still try to build some attack on the king's side, but here, well, there is no hurry. And just, I mean, it's such a major trump having this pawn on c5 here. Black plays the move g5. I think the author says that now the black position goes from being unpleasant to being really, really bad. He says that, well, something like, let's say, rook ac8 was more sensible. White can actually play b5 because you can never really undermine with b6, as we will just play c6, right? And, well, he gives a position like this and says white is obviously doing very well. And I think, yeah, it makes no sense to sort of try to fully clarify if white is winning or if he's only clearly better. But it's not a position you would take by black voluntarily, and with white you're obviously extremely happy here. The game was g5. Perhaps typical that in a situation where things has gone wrong for black, you are trying to create some kind of, well, what at least looks like counterplay, but pretty often you end up worsening your position just even more. Slight threat of knight takes d5 as e7 is hanging, but, well, the game goes like this. Here, rook a to c1. Perhaps from black's perspective, the last chance was now the move queen to f4. I noticed the computer was very strongly insisting on playing this move, and I know it's a typical move in some structures. I mean, for instance, let's say if it was a hanging pawn structure, it's very typical to do a move like this. Here, the reasons are slightly different. We will see in the next move, white is playing the move in the game. White goes g3, and this knight is completely stuck on h5. I think the idea of queen to f4 is simply preventing white from playing g3, as the knight would be hanging on f3. I mean, it's weird. Is that really enough reason to put your queen on a somewhat exposed square like f4? And the computer says, yes, very much so. And I think we get to grasp it in the game. After bishop f6, g3, I mean, this knight is also now sort of well, has difficulties rerouting into a decent position. And if the knight is not getting to f4, the g5 pawn is weak, and so on and so forth. Black tries a bit like this, rook to c8. The author makes the point now that white is just slowly building. I mean, there is no point to start cashing in your trumps too early. I mean, it's not like white is not better here, but why allow some kind of counterplay? So white is quietly putting the rook on c2, and he was preparing this very nice retreat, bishop to c1. I mean, maybe some would think if the bishop on c1, why not put it on the beautiful b2 square? But actually, I mean, this construction is so solid that it doesn't need to be backed up by a bishop on b2. On the contrary, on c1, the bishop starts eyeing a weakness on g5, and this structure turns out to be quite unpleasant. So the game goes bishop to d8, queen to d3, and not to allow knight g4, black now plays the moves f5. It indeed shuts out any kind of knight g4 options, but it also leaves a grave weakness in your camp. But I think we were at a stage where the computer says, whatever you do, it's going to end up badly. All there's left for black is to choose which way it's going to end up badly. So the game was like this, g4. And there's a nice combination in the end, so we'll just fast forward to that. I mean, basically, Drev has been completely outplaying his opponents strategically, but now he gets to finish it off with a nice tactic. So he sacrifices a rook, and like this, the queen can enter. Queen e6 is a horrible threat, and after rook h7, the game was like this, and well, the knight comes in from the side, attacking the g6 pawn, and the game went rook g8, takes, and now, well, here, and it's going to be mate on g8 with a rook next move, either after king g7 or if the rook retreats. The sort of final stages perhaps mattered less, I would say. I mean, already after a move like bishop to c1, it's just completely game over, says the computer. But I thought it's a very interesting start to the game. I mean, here, is it really so obvious that c5 is a huge strategical threat? It should be. For me, at least in my youth, it was not clear at all. I mean, it's the kind of move I would be afraid of playing, allowing with black. But with white, I would also feel quite uncertain about doing it. And I think, well, this is a great game showing how big the white advantage is and also how easy the position is to play after c5. I mean, it almost feels too strong to praise Drev for his play because everything seemed just so simple, right? I mean, you could point to highlights here and there, but in general, he just, put his pawn on b4, grabbed space, and reshuffled his pieces and just won easily. And the author says white is slightly better here. That's probably an understatement. White is clearly better here, and this pawn is a major asset. It's not always the case, but it's the kind of advantage that if it's good, it can be really good. So it's something to look out for, not allowing your opponent the good scenarios. And of course, you need it in your own arsenal to understand that, well, sometimes this can be just amazing and very simple for white, as we saw here. Our next example in this pawn structure is Getz against Istratescu. And again, white has this nice pawn on c5, which is very nice if things start to clarify. So quite logically, what black wants is to create a lot of confusion, or you will call it counterplay, before the dust settles. And Istratescu's next move is very typical, knight to e4. It's a strong idea. It creates tension immediately. And, well, white cannot just pick up a pawn, right? So let's say takes, you cannot play the move queen takes e4, because then the bishop on b5 would be hanging. So white is facing some kind of dilemma here, what to do, and forgets it goes very quickly wrong. Again, I mean, modern computers are pretty amazing. The computer is saying, well, why don't you just take on d7? And, well, I think the logical response is as knight takes c3, threatening the queen. But the computer says I can just do the move queen to d2. And, well, if you take my bishop, I'm going to take your knight and I still have my strong pawn. And you could make the argument, well, I'm just going to take on a2, and, well, my knights are protecting each other, and your bishop is going to be stuck on the d7 square. But the computer have spotted that there is this lovely move, bishop to a4. And somehow, well, for sure, you can take my bishop, but then I'm going to take your knight. The best you can do is to take on c1. We're going to take back. And when you take on a4, I'm also going to take back. It's true that now black has an extra pawn, no doubt about that. But the pawn on c5 is quite great compensation. And this pawn is also pretty weak. I guess we can double or even triple against it and probably win it back. And the computer says white is moderately better in this position. Not to any kind of decisive means, but I thought it's a cool tactical sequence. And it also gives away that even here in this example where it's supposed to be great for black and it ends up tremendous for black, even here due to the pawn on c5, white is actually still slightly better if he does it well. The computer makes another point that, well, if you want to protect the knight on c3, as we will see at the game, d2 is actually the correct square for the bishop. The point is that if we compare to what happens in the game, so let's say bishop takes knight, knight takes back, knight to c6, rook a to b1. I mean, the bishop in this position is quite obviously better placed than on b2 as we see in the game. If you look at it in this position, of course, now d2 square looks in some sense awkward and b2 looks more logical, right? But as soon as things clarifies, it becomes pretty clear that this is the correct square. Now the b file is open and it's much more solid on d2, and white is not worse here. So again, an interesting computer suggestion. But our game was knight e4 and gets played the very human concept bishop to b2. But now he ends up in a sad position. So takes on b5, takes back, and the move knight to c6. This is a very key theme with the pawn on c5, that can black have this strong blockading knight on c6 that not only blockades the pawn on c5, but also starts making d4 a weakness. I mean, we saw in the previous game that while Drev in no way had to hurry with c6, it was always a theme, and it was always clear that his pawn was quite mobile. I mean, he could back it up with a pawn going to b5, right? Now b pawns are exchanged, and there is this strong knight on c6. Suddenly, these pawns start to become weaknesses, and well, that's part of the interesting part of this structure. That, well, it's not an equalizing effect having a pawn structure like this. No, it's either pretty good for white or pretty good for black. The game continued knight to c3. Black played the move f5, which is a great move. It sort of reinforces this knight, and while you can make arguments that this pawn structure could be weakish, it's actually very strong. It reinforces the e4 square, and you can never really go knight e5 because, well, we're just going to exchange it and the c5 pawn is going to drop next, right? So it's a powerful knight like this. But I also want to pay attention to the move knight to g5. The computer says it's almost as good. The idea is to exchange this defender and now making the pawn on d4 even weaker, which means this knight on c6 is going to be extremely strong. I mean, imagine something like this. We have an immediate threat of knight takes d4, if rook d1. Let's say we back down here, you have to start caring about this pawn. We're going to go rook b8 next, queen a5, etc. I mean, the black position almost plays itself. The white position is very passive. All attention is going to be to defending this weak d4 pawn. It's also a very bad situation for black, so for white. So in this position, if you go knight g5 and play it very straightforward positionally, you play f5 like Istratescu, I really think it's a matter of style. Well, Getz chose to take on e4. I mean, something like rook a to b1 is possible. Black is going to follow up with bishop f6, put the queen on d7, and then the rook on b8. And, well, all his pieces are better, right? I mean, they all have very good functions. This knight on e4 is beautiful. This one attacks against the d4 pawn. And this knight both attack against d4 and blocks this pawn on c5. Black is obviously better here, no doubt. If it's better for white than in the game, it's hard to prove. Getz took on e4, and now the author again sort of, well, it's a book discussing structure, says that however you take on e4 is actually nice. I mean, this could be seen as perhaps more aggressive, keeping some attack down this file, and he gives the line something like this, and now suggests maybe changing the structure with e5, because when you, take here, we're going to have bishop c5. There's going to be pressure in this direction. And black is obviously better. But d takes e4 is also quite reasonable. If the knight starts going backwards, we can take this pawn. So in the game was queen c4. It's a nice intermezzo. The idea is, well, if we take on f3, then obviously we can take on e6 and c6 next, which would be really stupid from black's perspective. But there is a nice move, queen to d5. It's going to force off an exchange of queens like this. And in this position, well, we threaten on b2, now we threaten on d4, and the game was f4 like this. Well, it's obvious black is much, much better, right? I mean, the white pieces are only focused on defending a weak pawn. Black has activity in the b file, and also he has a very nice spatial edge like this. So black is clearly better here and managed to win the game. If this is a bigger advantage than some of the others I showed, it's hard to say, but it's very much a lot. I thought an interesting example, right? I mean, we get to see this very typical move, knight to e4, trying to create confusion or rather counterplay before white managed to stabilize his advantage. And it worked so well for black in the game. But I still think that, well, this tactic is very funny. Somehow that we untangle like this and we end up almost being better is nice. And I thought also it's instructive that in this position, it looks so obvious putting the bishop on b2, right? But that actually on d2, it's considerably better. And then when we just fast forward a couple of moves, it actually becomes very visually easy to understand that d2 and not b2 is sort of where we should put the bishop. But it is not easy in this position, grasping that, well, this passive bishop move is much stronger than putting it in so-called active diagonal. So I think a cool example for a number of reasons, but still a reminder that while this is an example that's supposed to be great for black, and it turns out like this, we saw with just a couple of imaginative tactical moves, this c5 pawn still will give white some kind of edge. Our next example is Klund against Dautov. Again, white has this nice pawn on c5 with the sort of space advantage it comes with, but black has gotten counterplay with the knight on e4. We saw last time that getting a strong knight on e4, black would sort of cover it with the f5 pawn, but here, actually that doesn't really work. White is just going to play a3, and it's going to be extremely hard to stop b4 next, with a huge spatial advantage for white. So the correct move is in this position to take on c3 actually. White has to take back, and it even comes with a gain of tempi, right? Because you're threatening the pawn on h7. So black has to play h6, but after castling, black has this nice move b6. It's just undermining the pawn on c5. I mean, well, this pawn on c5, there's just no way to sort of keep protecting on c5 under decent circumstances. You could just take on b6, of course, but then, well, the spatial advantage is completely gone. What's left is a weak pawn on c3. So the white position is already somewhat dubious here. Klund tries rook fb1. It's a creative attempt. The idea is if you take on c5, at least we can play rook b5, and next we can take on c5, and we keep having at least an outpost in the opponent's camp like this. But Dautov is not gonna allow any of this. He's gonna play the move bishop to a6. I think it's a decently useful exchange of bishops as well. And after takes, Klund took on b6. The author says it would probably be better to interpolate the move knight to e5. The idea is if you take here, we have this tactical sort of move knight to d7, attacking in both directions. And, well, his argument is that if after knight e5 you go rook f to c8, at least we can play the knight to d3, and if you take here, we will take back with the knight, and there is no sort of immediate problems with our weak pawns like this. It's a fair point, but I still think black is slightly better there. It's true, in the game, it was like take on b6, and after queen b3, well, black could start defending this pawn, but Dautov just went rook f to c8, and if white takes here, he's gonna take back like this. And, well, one way or the other, it's going to be a weak pawn on c3 or on a2, and black is just pleasantly slightly better here. So I think a good example here. I mean, we get to see that, well, while in the previous game, the counterplay was getting a knight on e4 and keeping it there. Just exchanging on c3 can actually lead to structural problems for white. And we get to see once again that, I mean, this pawn on c5, I mean, it's either very strong or actually a considerable problem. And here, well, white seems to have expanded too quickly, and doubts have just easily sort of exchanged the pieces, then started undermining the pawn on c5, and we saw very quickly it's just ended up in a very pleasant structure for black. So, well, it's very important to understand that this pawn on c5, it can be great, but it can also be very bad. So it really comes with a warning sign for sort of, well, it's very much a risk-reward play, and the risk is considerable at times. Our final game in this structure is Rahman against Aryushenko from 2011. And, well, I think black obviously has quite a pleasant position, I would say, or at least very decent. I mean, the knight on e1 and these bishops, it doesn't seem very dynamic at all, right? The question is, how should black start developing an initiative? Well, the computer actually says a move like a5 could be a good place to start, and maybe later put the bishop to f8. But that's sort of going a bit away from our theme. The book wants to move c5, and it's quite a reasonable move. Again, it raises the question, is c4 a threat? And the author thinks, yeah, it is, while the computer is a little bit less sure. Part of it is sort of evaluating what is the lesser evil from white's perspective. The author wants to take on c5. It forces an Isolani position because we can't do the hanging pawns as the bishop, well, then he's hanging on b7. And hanging pawns is okay, hanging bishops, not so much, right? So we have to go knight takes c5 and we get an Isolani position. Generally, you know, when you get an Isolani with black, you feel that you're trying to equalize, while with white you think you have an initiative. But here it's obvious that the white pieces are very passive, so this is quite tempting for black. And also, well, the queen is exposed. If you go to a3, we can immediately go bishop to f8, which create some pretty unfortunate tension. So probably queen c2 is better, but even here rook c8. We start harassing immediately. And it's a beautiful Isolani situation for black, no doubt, and I think he's somewhat better. So that after c5, Rahman played the move bishop f3. Our author is somewhat critical of that, but that's a little bit too strong. I think the computer says, yeah, I mean, the black has a very pleasant position, white has to do something. This is not particularly worse than anything else. So Aryushenko grabs the space with c4, and the queen falls back like this, and he follows up with a6. And, well, the idea is obvious, right? We're going to play b5 next, we're going to reinforce the pawn on c4, and, well, we are close to getting this kind of Dreyev situation we saw in our first example, where it's just going to be very, very cramped for white. This is an important moment, and I think the best move by far is to play the move a4. Sometimes getting into play a4, stopping b5 can actually be very powerful. We will undermine with b3 next. And, well, if we manage to undermine to the extent that this pawn disappears, well, then actually there will be scenarios where, you know, you're just left with a weak pawn, and it's actually white who would be better here. In this position, fortunately for black, there is the move bishop to c6. And after b3, we have to reply b5. But now, due to the inclusion of a4 and a6, we can swap a pair of pawns, then swap the other one, and now play the rook to a1. The computer says that, sure, black is slightly better here, but we have managed to exchange pawns in the sort of a and b file. We have gotten an open file to make exchanges. And this knight on c3 is very stable behind this pawn. Maybe the knight can come to c2 later. I mean, we are not at all talking about white being better. We are talking about white having these chances to equalize, and that somehow he's managed to exchange enough things that the position has stabilized to an extent where things are not too bad. The game was b3. But now after b5 and this exchange, I think while, yes, rook b1 happens, it threatens on b7, but black is going to defend it. Not having the a file open probably helps black. I mean, the game was like this, and I think the position being a little bit more cramped makes it easier for black. Also, the b5 square is protected, there is no knight b5, and it's a pleasant position for black. He played the move knight f8 in the game. The author praises it goes to e6. It looks very logical. The computer actually wants to play bishop f8 instead. But I think it's decently obvious that this position is more pleasant for black than, let's say, this position. I mean, here it looks like exchanges are coming and things are not too bad for black. Here it is a middle game position. This pawn is very much an asset. And while the knight on c3 is strong, the counterplay seems to be less sort of quick than in the previous example. So here black is just pleasantly better. So I think a nice final example. I mean, the plan with c5 I find quite nice, both in terms of that if we get an Isolani, it's important to understand that even as black in Isolani scenarios, things can be quite pleasant and we get to harass the queen quite a lot here. And well, this structure generally is promising for sort of black, with this pawn on c4 being rather strong than weak. But this sort of intermezzo of a4 is also extremely important, both in terms of that it can actually end up worse for the pawn, the one with the advanced pawns, if it gets fully undermined. But even as in our example, just that it leads to useful exchanges that can be used in a defensive manner. So I think a good final example showing some of the pluses, some of the transformations, but also how to defend against it by trying to undermine with this a4 move. So, well, that finishes off this structure.